I don't just talk about other people's stuff, I also make my own. Books in particular. To date, I have 4 books you can check out on Amazon. Operation Red Dragon: The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, Occult Mafia, Emerald of Maddox City, and the short story collection Assorted Absurdities, Tales of Kaiju Punk and Other Genres. Hop on down to the description for Amazon links to all 4 books. Enjoy whichever ones you read, and enjoy the video.
Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am the Omni viewer, and I just wanted to do a very quick video to review today's thing because I pre-ordered it a while ago. I've been waiting forever for it to get here. Now that it's finally here, I don't want to waste any more time. Ladies and gentlemen, you may know that I am a big fan of movie soundtracks, in addition to being a big fan of kaiju, so naturally I'm a big fan of kaiju movie soundtracks, which are very hard to come by these days, physical or digital. I mean, if you get a new movie release, maybe you're gonna get something. The MonsterVerse movies have gotten 3 out of 4 CDs released, but for the most part, it's very hard to find stuff, especially if it's the original Godzilla stuff. I've acquired what I can, but some still elude me. And yet, when I learned about this thing, I knew I had to pick it up and at least give it its fair shot, because it sounded like something that would be right up my alley, actually, and I didn't know what it would sound like, but I was curious to know. The album in question is entitled Godzilla vs. Rodan: The Spiritual Voices of Akira Ifukube by Bukimisha. Now, if you haven't heard of Bukimisha, it's possible that they just want you to think that way. Bukimisha over in Japan styles itself as sort of a weird secret society, their own term. All of their members are anonymous, and they are an a cappella singing group. They do specifically vocal reconstructions of different film scores. This album, if you haven't already guessed, contains the 1954 score for Godzilla and the 1956 score for Rodan, all realized in a cappella form. Now that is a very unusual thing, you must admit. It's not the sort of thing you generally hear. You can hear vocal kind of music in film scores. Kaiju movies are no stranger to that. The Mothra song, of course, is one of the most popular pieces to come out of the entire kaiju genre. Bear McCreary's score for Godzilla King of the Monsters 2019 contained a lot of chanting of Gojira, Mosura, Ghidorah, and Rodan. And I think it worked very well in that context. I know some people who thought it was too much and perhaps a little campy, but they were going for monster opera with that movie. You expect something operatic even from the music. But anyway, the thing is, this is entirely voices. Human voices without alteration, as far as I can tell. And that presents an interesting challenge. What I mean by presenting a challenge is actually twofold. You see, those of you who have heard the original scores as they've been released physically or digitally from different Toho productions, like Godzilla, Rodan, the Mysterians, and so on, you may notice that they contain sound effects in addition to music. They'll contain the roars, the footsteps, lasers, anything that might be somehow related to the monsters, or the ships, or whatever. And it's a really neat feature that I wish more soundtracks did. I know there are a couple of Star Trek soundtracks that do that sort of thing, like Star Trek Generations of all things. After it finishes the music, it has multiple tracks of just sounds from the Enterprise and the Klingon ships and everything. But it's a rare thing. And usually, especially in the original Godzilla soundtrack, the sound effects can actually be part of the music. And that's partly because Akira Ifukube actually did the sound effects in addition to the music. He used instruments. That's one of the secrets of the Godzilla series. So, but those sounds are not a usual kind of sound. So the question then becomes, how do you replicate it with human voices that aren't altered in any way post-production? Well, the answer is that you don't really replicate it. You make something that sounds like a monster roaring and footsteps walking away. It's not going to be exact, and I don't think it's realistic for anyone to expect it to be, but the way it sounds really does work. It fits thematically with everything else you hear on the album, so it blends nicely, and it's memorable. Again, it doesn't sound exactly like Godzilla, but it works in context. Then there's another part of the challenge. Some of the music, and I'm talking about the actual music here, some of it is not necessarily melodic. Some of it isn't even really music, it's noise. I'm thinking specifically of something like Horror in the Water Tank from the Godzilla soundtrack, where the musical cue for the oxygen destroyer are string instruments making this weird scratching, shrieking noise that's just kind of meant to get under your skin and unsettle you. Now, how do you replicate something like that vocally, you may ask? I'm not going to play any clips here because I don't want to start off the new year by potentially getting a copyright strike, but I can tell you, they found a way. Again, it's not exact, but they found a way to make it work. And I do think it works. I admit that I have a little bit of bias because I like a cappella music. I was actually very briefly part of a barbershop quartet back in the day. Well, not a quartet, just a group. But the group still has the 4 parts. You don't care. The fact is, I have an appreciation and an understanding of a cappella music, having been on the other side of it. So listening to it, I can really appreciate when it's done very well. And Bukimisha really does it well. And it's especially interesting because the Rodan soundtrack is part of this, and you generally don't see the Rodan soundtrack circulated around here. It's not one of those soundtracks that is as known outside of the movie. There hasn't been a physical release. I think there's a digital release. I don't know if there still is, because, you know, licensing is always up in the air. But getting to hear either of these rendered in such a different way, this is going to be a weird comparison, but it's almost kind of like listening to cello rock. You know, you get used to hearing rock and roll or heavy metal made with a very specific set of instruments. Guitars, drums, bass, maybe keyboards, depending on how melodic you're trying to be. But then you come across something like Apocalyptica or Two Cellos or one of those bands, which is still in that genre, but realized entirely through cellos. And it can be an acquired taste because it sounds so different, but if you can acquire that taste, you're really in for something special. That's kind of what this album is like, except instead of cellos, it's chanting and making weird sounding noises that would just sound like gibberish in any other context. Here, though, it definitely works. But there's something else interesting about this. You may hear all this and think, well, I've already got the original Godzilla soundtrack, either as a CD or downloaded, or I went super retro hipster and got a vinyl LP. But either way, I already have it. What incentive do I have to get this aside from the Rodan soundtrack? Well, this is where it gets interesting. There's a piece on the Godzilla side of this album that is not available anywhere else. It's a track called Cemetery. It's track number 8. And the sheet music for it exists, as far as I know, but it's never actually been recorded, and it's not in the movie. No one is actually sure where it was supposed to be in the movie. The best guess anyone can think of is that it was somewhere on Odo Island, most likely after Godzilla's late night stroll, where we don't quite see him yet, but we get a brief glimpse of him as he's pushing past that one building. That's the best anyone can figure, but that song, Cemetery, not available on any of the official releases, not in the movie, very rarely heard. I'll bet some of you didn't even know it was a thing until I said it just now. Well, it's on here. It is a very atmospheric number. I mean, I'd be curious to hear what the original version would have sounded like, sure, but if the only version I ever heard was this vocal version, I'd be satisfied. As far as Rodan, the liner notes don't say if there are any lost tracks in here. There is a bonus track, that's the Rodan main title, that contains the sound effects, and by that I mean the roars, which again are recreated with voices and are not exact, but they still sound good in context. But otherwise, it's still worth listening to, I think. This is a very different kind of album, and this is the first Bukimisha album that has ever been released stateside, at all. Now, you might also want to look into getting the American version of it, because the original Japanese versions, in addition to being two separate albums, according to the liner notes, Bukimisha likes to mess around with its listeners, so they leave gaps that can last for minutes upon minutes upon minutes, and then suddenly do sound effects or start into the music just to mess with you. Sort of the whole, oh, you left the CD running while you were on a long drive kind of thing. If anyone still knows what that's like these days, as more and more cars do away with CD players. But anyway, there are no gaps or anything like that on the American release, which allows them to fit both Godzilla and Rodan on one disc. According to the liner notes, though, this is not the only stuff they've done. They've also done some Ultraman music, apparently. And I'd love to hear what that sounds like. I'd love to hear more of these guys just in general. So, if you're curious, I definitely think Godzilla vs. Rodan is worth listening to. I think it's worth owning as well, but I mean, I like to own physical copies of my stuff, and I'm a fan of soundtracks anyway. Either way, like, I'm pretty sure you can hear samples of their work on YouTube, so if you're curious and you want to give it a little bit of a listen before you buy, that's the easy thing to do. But it really does get a high recommendation from me. This took a while to get to me because it's not going to be a common item, and I ordered it from a smaller brick and mortar store that I like to support. But otherwise, I mean, what else can I say? I like this album. I think it's an interesting, unique listening experience. And if you're a Kaiju fan or you're looking for something a little bit different to add to your musical repertoire, I think you guys will like it too. Anyway, that's about all I've got for this very quick, unscripted review. Now on to the scripted stuff. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off.
Congratulations, you reached the end. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to consider supporting us on Patreon. Of course, the other way to support us is to go to Amazon and check out our books, Operation Red Dragon, The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, The Occult Mafia, Emerald of Maddox City, and Assorted Absurdities, Tales of Kaiju Punk and Other Genres. Also check the description for links to DeviantArt and other platforms we operate. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.